The Touhou Project. A simple university project, developed in 1996 and all created by one man, Junya Ota, also known as Zun. For many people, this series is home to just about everything, ranging from the visually mesmerizing spell cards, the endless rosters of iconic and unique characters, the limitless barrage of terribly overdone memes and shitposts, and whatever the hell this is. Well, that seems to be the case for quite a large sector of the community. For someone like me, the Touhou Project represents something greater. As a long-term fan of the series, it wasn't exactly the hellfire of Danmaku which drew me in, nor was it the abundance of fan games, nor even the overflow of jokes and memes from the community. The one element which hooked me into the Touhou Project retained my interest throughout all these years and played a significant role in my life was nothing other than the soundtrack. I received my first taste of it all the way back in 2013, and since those 11 years had passed, I had only grown closer and more greatly attached to these experiences. To me, the soundtrack of this project is more than that. It's not a soundtrack, it's an emotional journey. It brings me places which no other series, no matter how hard they try, can ever possibly achieve. It outlines a sense of beauty which simply can't be put into feelings, and makes me emotional without a single word. It brings me through the emotions which linger deep inside and can never seem to let go, cementing my lifelong love for this project. It's a journey through a magical realm. A realm by the name of Genzyokyo. It's difficult for me to state the impact this series has had on my life. In fact, this is the question I've been attempting to answer ever since I'd been first drawn into the series. Why do I love the Touhou Project? It all boils down to the soundtrack. After all, it was the one element which hooked me in the first place, with the goal of hopefully seeking the answer to this question once and for all. I plan to analyze, evaluate, and rank all 19 mainline games based on their soundtrack. Being the one element of the series which I take most to heart, it's something that I have fantasized about ever since my first exposure. I know for a fact that it won't be an easy task. Whomever said that individually evaluating 19 separate titles would be something that any reasonable fan of the project would be able to accomplish? Despite that, no matter the struggles, through all the ups and all the downs, I am willing to take on this endeavor. But hang on, I've been talking quite a lot about the purpose of this whole ordeal. What if this isn't the result, and it won't actually help me answer this fundamental question? Well, if that's the case, I will continue to seek out the answer, all in order to finally put the question, why do I truly love this project, to rest. After all, this series has fulfilled its service to me for more than a decade now, and altered my perspective in ways which no other series can ever hope to accomplish. There is no task monumental enough where I could simply return the favor, but seeking the answer to this question is the least I could do to pay my respect to the Touhou Project. Okay, enough of that. We can lighten up the mood a little bit. Now, before I move any further, I would like to establish some baselines. How I am typically familiar with the series, at least according to this image used to differentiate characters on the Touhou wiki. The Touhou Project is typically split up into 4 separate generations, those being the PC-98 generation, the Windows 1st generation, the Windows 2nd generation, and the Windows 3rd generation, with the Windows generations being much more relevant to the modern day community. For those unaware, the term PC-98 refers to the PC-9800 series of computers which house the first 5 games from the project. The reason I'm even bringing this up is due to the vastly inferior systems from those computers compared to most modern machines. This resulted in a major quality contrast between the first 5 games from the project, known as the PC-98 generation, and all following games after then, collectively referred to as the Windows generation. Because of this, at least in my own personal opinion, it doesn't feel particularly fair to compare titles from the PC-98 generation with titles from the Windows generation, especially talking soundtracks. As a result, for this video at least, I'll solely be constricting myself to the PC-98 generation. And besides, despite their unpopularity compared to the Windows generation, the PC-98 games really deserve their own separate video. With that being said, what about the Windows generation? Well, as much as I'd like to discuss those titles, it's a bit out of the scope for today's video. Maybe in the future will they be getting their own spotlight, but as of now, those titles will simply have to wait. I know everyone is eager to kick this thing off, but just a few more things I'd like to mention before we actually begin. First of all, these rankings are based entirely upon my own personal opinions surrounding the soundtrack, and since I aim to formulate the analysis almost extensively using my own personal beliefs surrounding Zun's compositional and musical decisions, I won't be surprised, and am entirely expecting, to come up with some pretty decisive opinions or ideas when it comes to certain tracks or titles. But realistically, I understand that on such a subjective topic, disagreements are bound to happen somewhere. Also, I want to make it clear that I may come off as slightly harsh or critical of a certain topic, but it's simply a reflection of my own personal thoughts. Even if it doesn't always sound like it, I honestly do like all the games and soundtracks to some extent. Finally, for both my and your listening pleasure, for these PC-98 titles, rather than referencing the original PC-98 tracks, I will instead be using their Accu's Untouched score equivalent. If you don't know, these are basically remastered versions of the PC-98 soundtracks, and they sound much better than their original counterparts. I understand, it's not exactly the genuine experience, but these were the versions I was listening to when I was making this video, so they're the versions I'll be using. And besides, we're separating this from the Windows generation regardless, so I don't really see a major issue here. Alright, I think I've done enough talking about logistics. You're here for the rankings. So I think it's about time that we finally kick this off. Well, we had to start somewhere, and if there was one game which I had to start on, highly responsive to prayers, I'm sorry. First things first with this title, it wasn't even a shoot 'em up, and it's the only title in the main game lineup where this is the case. Obviously, this means that a shmup-oriented soundtrack wouldn't exactly work for a game such as this, but I don't think this itself is the issue. The major issue I'm having with the soundtrack was the thematic directions it took, or as you'll soon learn, the lack of it. Don't get me wrong, for the first game, it's not too bad. Considering what it had going for itself being the first game, it's actually pretty good. But compared to the rest of the PC-98 series, this game really does not hold up very well. All the other titles were much better than this one in terms of musical quality. But in honesty, it's difficult for me to judge this one fairly, since it's so different from what I typically expect from the project. But my point is, ignoring the disconnect compared to the rest of the PC-98s and focusing solely on the musical capabilities of each title, I can confirm that Highly Responsive to Prayers has the most inferior soundtrack. There were definitely a few highs, as well as a few lows. Well, probably more lows than highs, but it was definitely a start. The major gripe I have with the soundtrack is simply that many of the themes don't really feel like they have much of an identity to build off of. This of course implies that Highly Responsive to Prayers itself doesn't really have much of a complex story for the player to focus on in the first place. Now, I know what you're thinking. I thought you were analyzing the soundtrack. What's all this talk about the story? I get it, but as you'll quickly come to learn, the story of each title plays a major role in its soundtrack, and vice versa. But back to the topic at hand. I find it really difficult to sympathize with the theme when I have a difficult time considering what it even represents in the first place. And in Highly Responsive to Prayers, that issue is abundant. Throughout the soundtrack, character themes often represent something about the character. Chirano's theme represents her childish nature with a really lighthearted melody. Yes, I'm calling her Chirano for the sake of this video. Reiko's theme represents her taiko characteristics with the really heavy emphasis on percussion. And Byakuran's theme represents her religious significance within the story, with the really overpowering atmosphere. Unfortunately, Shin Gyoku, Ellis, and Serial really just can't compete with this. Partly because we have pretty much zero information about them due to the fact that this game has like no dialogue. How the hell do I make a thematic connection when I don't even know who I'm fighting? Sadly, the stage themes falter to the same fate. There's not a lot to many of these stage themes, so it's difficult to give them any real praise when they feel rather superficial in this context. Understandably, there's not much that necessarily needs to be established in the stages, other than, you know, where you are. But at least in most of the other games, we get some sort of context as to the significance of the location. In Highly Responsive to Prayers, however, Reimu just kinda goes wherever the player wants. I mean, you literally get to choose at one point of the game. There isn't even an in-game explanation as to why she decides to go where she's going, so it feels rather incoherent from the already lacking story. Moving on from all that, focusing solely on the musical quality itself, yeah, I can confirm this was not the musical peak of the project. There isn't much I want to critique, since this was the literal starting point, but a lot of these themes just feel really primitive. Really primitive. Take Angel's Legend, for example, which is just the same simple melody and synth pattern transposed and repeated for the entire duration of the fight. I can't see most of these arrangements being considered great by today's standards. For me, a lot of the tracks just lacked personality and character, and the little you could squeeze out just felt really surface level. Because of that, I really don't find this soundtrack that memorable. A lot of my favorite titles have the ability to bring the character through such immersive experiences through a combination of factors. If it's done well, it really makes the soundtrack pay off in the end. But with Highly Responsive to Prayers, I don't even know where to start. There really isn't much put in, so there's really not much you could get out. Coming back to Angel's Legend, apart from just being your typical boss fight, thematically, I don't really know what I'm supposed to be getting out from this. And what does that have to do with Yugen Magen or Mima? I mean, come on, it's not like he made this just to act as a base for his other themes, right? Oh, for f***. You're really not giving me much to work with, man. Knowing that this is what he had to say about this track is all I really needed to know. I get it, you had to start somewhere, but if the creator himself is calling this a model for his current boss themes, I don't think there's much else I need to say. Alright, I know I've been complaining for the past 5 minutes, but I actually do have some good things to say about this soundtrack. There are a few tracks I think are pretty good, even by PC-98 standards. The first one is Kongara's theme, Angel of a Distant Star. This theme undoubtedly felt like what a lot of the boss themes from this game could have been, opposed to most other themes like the aforementioned Angel's Legend, which just felt like the same thing copied over and over again. This theme really felt like it had some musical progression to it. It starts off slow, but as it goes on, it continues to layer on more and more instruments to the track, until it suddenly breaks through into a much more aggressive and combative melody appropriate for this fight. It shows both sides of this fight, and it helps to make this stage much more intimidating, which I love. And also, so does Kongara herself. I mean, she's a giant samurai covering up half the screen. Apart from that, I really like the first in-game theme, Eternal Shrine Maiden. It's rather significant to the project, knowing that this was the first time that you were to properly see the protagonist of the entire series, Reimu Hakare. It really introduces a sense of courage and valor directed towards the main character, which heavily impacts our perception of her, since in this game we didn't really get much of that through other sources. I mean, she's this tiny girl fighting off these mythical demons with a magical ball and stick. That's pretty damn deserving of some recognition if you ask me. Yeah, that's kind of all there is to this game. Despite many of its flaws, Highly Responsive to Prayers holds a special place in many players' hearts, including mine. After all, it was the birthplace of the series that we all know and love. And because of this, even if it didn't follow the traditional shoot 'em up style, it still holds a decent amount of charm within the modern community. Although there were many improvements that had to be made along the way before the Touhou Project's true identity began to take shape, it was only the beginning. Story of Eastern Wonderland was the second Touhou game to ever be released, and respectively, it's the second game I'm going to be talking about. If I take this game as the successor to something like Highly Responsive to Prayers, it's really good. It's quite a drastic improvement to that game in many different ways, but taking this game in the context of the rest of the project, or even the rest of the PC-98 era, it's just alright. It's really unfortunate that I have to say that, since I love this game's soundtrack, and it has some of the most amusing PC-98 tracks. This isn't a testament to how poor this game is. The game is pretty good, but rather how much better the other games are. This game isn't flawless. Far from it, actually. But was it a step in the right direction? Hell yeah. The best way I could describe Story of Eastern Wonderland's soundtrack is just unhinged. It's kinda just a mess, and all over the place. But I think that's kind of the reason why I love it. You know, I think Zun himself said it the best. Even though the story for this game is a joke, the music is so serious and the enemies are so hard. I like that kind of mismatch. Well, you're not the only one, Zun. I would note that he made this statement talking specifically about the first in-game theme, Hakurei Eastern Wind, and following this theme, it doesn't take long to understand his point. This theme is great for an introduction to the story, and although this wasn't my initial impression, I could kinda get at that serious tone that he was mentioning. But if we just go a little bit further, there we are. You get to the stage boss Rika, and her theme, She's in a Temper. It throws just about any sense of caution to the wind, and exists completely unbarred compared to the uncertain atmosphere of Hakurei Eastern Wind. But I love it. I can almost sense the joy emanating from this theme, and I can only imagine Zun composing this theme, sipping his beer, and having the time of his life creating this melody. Like, can we get a nice Zun pick to represent that? Perfect. Examples like these are basically Story of Eastern Wonderland in a nutshell. And trust me, it only gets more apparent from here. You know, I wasn't lying. If you didn't think the first stage was a good example, may I introduce the Stage 2 theme, End of Daylight, and the Stage 3 theme, World of Empty Dreams. The somberness of these themes without a doubt caught me off guard in the context of this title, but given enough time for them to truly sink in, my thoughts upon these tracks have completely shifted. I see both of them as a major step in Zun's musical development, being some of the first moments where Zun presents a more serious tone for the project, and it helps to paint a picture as to where he would be taking this in the future. The Touhou Project isn't always about flashy danmaku, or flamboyant instrumentals, or signature personas. Sometimes it's the slow, reflective pieces which outshine in these scenarios. It's the real reason I love this project. I can of course jam out to some pretty killer melodies like Necrophantasia, or Lunatic Princess, or Hartman's Yokai Girl. But when it comes to more serious tones, like Border of Life, or Extended Ash, Person of Horai, or Emotional Skyscraper, or even World of Empty Dreams. They seem to hit much closer to home. Anyway, I hold these tracks in such high regard because it feels like this is where that all started, which is kind of funny, since based on how Zun discusses these tracks in his musical comments, suggests to me that these tracks serve just about no purpose apart from being somber and contrasted with the rest of the story. Yeah, that in addition to making me seem like a fool for everything I said in the past minute and a half. Like, seriously, why did I write this again? But seriously, this was the origin. It's almost emotional to think about, since it was such a primitive version of the modern Genzokyo we know today. There's nothing more than Reimu, who has nothing to do but prove herself. It was a time before many of the modern events which would come to define the project. There was just about no yokai, no evil spirits, no fantasy seal, no Mariah Shrine, no dumb fairies, rowdy oni, human village, pad jokes, overdrive, Aya tabloids, Daidara Bochi, angry moms, lunar capital, yukaris, moon rabbits, moon bitches, scarlet police, scheming foxes, cat girls, Marissa Flander, Koishi Yomu, Sakura Emilia, Moku, Satori, Yuyiko, Alice, Sane, Aya, Raisin, Cerno, Yukari, and just about all the over 150-ish characters which have yet to be released. There is none of that here. Maybe this is what the Touhou Project truly represents. Is it just a muse, using these cute characters and addictive soundtracks to distract us from the fact that nothing really matters in the end? and that there's nothing we could do on this earth to save us from the inevitable heat death of the— Alright, stage 4. There's nothing better than Zun developing some sort of somber tone within the first couple of stages, and then just going, you know what, fuck that, we're rocking the shit out now. You'd think it wouldn't work, but he does it in other games, and it works. So, yeah. Moving on. I'll stand by the fact that a lot of the stage themes in Story of Eastern Wonderland are surprisingly solid, and tracks such as Himorogi, Burn and Violet really help to demonstrate that. Similar to how the previous 2 stage themes serve to showcase the direction Zun plans to take this project in the future, this theme demonstrates that Zun seriously just has the capability to produce some straight up bangers. The energy and the really cool switch up in the middle of this theme is great. I absolutely love it. As I said, the improvement in stage themes between Highly Responsive to Prayers and this is just shocking. But hang on, let's not forget the boss themes here. Those themes were pretty solid. You know, you're fighting against a female samurai and 5 spheres made from I don't fucking know, let's just move on. Oh, Marissa, sensible character, finally. Wait, didn't I just say we didn't have Marissa? Anyway, that's Marissa. You may not believe me, since she looks nothing like Marissa, but believe me, that's Marissa. Also, her theme is literally called Love Colored Magic, and is the precursor melody to Love Colored Master Spark, so yes, that is indeed Marissa. Okay, in all seriousness, I actually find the similarities between Love Colored Magic from this game and Love Colored Master Spark from Imperishable Night, which was the first Windows game where she appeared with her own theme, pretty remarkable. Shut up. Considering the fact that she has like 7 different fucking themes from the games alone, and how Love Colored Master Spark is just about ubiquitously associated with Marissa, even though it originated from a game that came out in 1997, that's pretty freaking badass. If I were there back then, I never would have thought that something like Love Colored Magic from Story of Eastern Wonderland would simply take over the project to the extent which it has. But hey, you're not gonna hear me complaining. Okay, final boss time. Yeah, this game only has 5 stages, and I have no clue why it does. Anyway, as the first official last stage in the context of a shmup, it's pretty exciting to see how Zun would play this out, and it really wasn't that bad, especially considering that he didn't really have anything to base this off of. At least it paves the way for the final boss. Speaking of final bosses, it looks like it's going to be... Wait, it's Mima? Why is she the boss now? You were in the last game, what the fuck? Mima. Where would the PC-98 generation be without you? If you're at least a little familiar with the PC-98 generation, I'm sure you understand her significance as a character. So I'm sure you totally won't hate me when I say that Mima's theme from this game, Complete Darkness, is pretty underwhelming. I'll come up clean and say there isn't anything I hate that brings this down. It's just that it's hard to close Story of Eastern Wonderland, a game flooded with some of the most emotionally intriguing tracks of the PC-98 generation, with something like Mima's theme, which, as I said, feels rather underwhelming in just about all departments. Although I can't deny that it's a well-crafted song. It just didn't have the energy which I was looking for. I feel like Shinki's theme from Mystic Square would just be the perfect way to close this story. But even limited to our current chronology, Marissa's theme, or even Kangara's theme from Highly Responsive to Prayers, probably would have been a better closer. Even the final stage theme itself probably would have been more superior. I realize that while recording this, it makes me sound like very critical of this theme. I don't hate the theme, it's a good theme. I'm just trying to say that for the energy I expected from the previous 4 stages, I was kind of expecting something a little bit more intense for the ending. I know I kind of slandered Mima here, but please don't tear me apart in the comments. That's like the whole reason I'm making this voiceover. This theme just felt kinda dead, like Mima herself. Hang on, I meant that in the way that she was like a spirit, not that she was never gonna return to the project. What do you mean? I mean, of course I think she could still return. She'll be a great character to have in the Windows generation, just like Rin. Hang on, she didn't even make it into the games. Fuck! Well, I wasn't gonna forget the extra stage. As if analyzing just about every single stage in the project wasn't enough, yes, I decided to do the extra stages as well. I heavily regret this decision. The amount of themes I have to analyze is turning my brain into mush. I'm losing my shit! I'm not gonna speak much about this one since there's not much to unfurl, but this stage themes are honestly pretty good, I'm not gonna lie. Although both the stage and boss themes sound almost identical, they're both quite bouncy and energetic and are very reminiscent of our previous boss themes, such as Mayra and the 5 Magic Stones. Or Rika's first theme from stage 1, we're fighting her again after all. That being said, that's all I have to say about this extra stage. Well, that's where Story of Eastern Wonderland comes to a close. And if I had to admit, on a bit of a misleading conclusion. Even though I ended up rating this as my second least favorite game in terms of soundtrack, Story of Eastern Wonderland is, without a doubt, one of the most intriguing and unique musical experiences throughout the entire history of the project. It was where the true bulk of the series began to take shape, and it ultimately paved the huge road for what this project would become in the future. Not everything made the final cut down the line, but it really demonstrated what we were to expect from the later titles, and gave us a little hint of the type of genius Zun would have up his sleeve. Despite that, it didn't really come together as well as I'd optimally hoped, and combined with the hit-or-miss nature one were to expect when it came to something like this, caused it to get the short end of the stick for me. But even if Story of Eastern Wonderland sits near the bottom of this list, it's definitely a name I'll never forget anytime soon. When it comes to Lotus Land Story, I found it to be the most inconsistent game of the PC-98 era in terms of musical quality. There were some themes that I felt blew the other PC-98 themes out of the water, and some which were so mundane and monotonous that I honestly forgot they even existed in the first place. I obviously don't expect myself to enjoy every single track of the entire game's soundtrack, but me liking only about half of this game's tracks surely isn't that outstanding. On the positive side, however, this felt like the first game which really seemed to hammer down the typical Touhou formula we were to see throughout the rest of the series, which, thinking about it, just sounds completely insane. It seriously took 4 games before we got to the typical 6-stage shmup. Anyway, does knowing that Lotus Land Story was the first game to immortalize the conventional 6-stage story make it any more enjoyable? No. Lotus Land Story may have been significantly pivotal in this series' history, but the soundtrack, yet again, still had some work to be done. There definitely were issues in other games which prevented me from truly enjoying their soundtrack. For Highly Responsive to Prayers, it was the lack of identity for its tracks. For Story of Eastern Wonderland, it was the chaotic continuities between tracks. So what's the deal with Lotus Land Story? Well, if it were one thing, it would be the lack of consistency between tracks. Is that the same thing as Story of Eastern Wonderland? Not really. The major difference is that in Story of Eastern Wonderland, all the tracks were pretty good. None of them were too bad. In Lotus Land Story, however, some tracks from this game were absolutely fantastic, and then there were tracks which weren't. Take the first 2 stage bosses, Orange and Kurumi for example, which are genuinely just nothing in terms of the overall soundtrack. Well, most of the time I would have something notable to say about these types of tracks. This isn't the case here. At least Story of Eastern Wonderland took a unique turn when it came to its beginning themes, but not in Lotus Land Story. A lot of the more unique sounding tracks, or tracks which attempted to break some notable ground, failed to do so in that respect. And the traditional sounding tracks, or tracks which follow the traditional sound seen in the project, just felt obscenely monotonous, to the point where I truly believe that Story of Eastern Wonderland did it better. Break the Sabbath from Stage 2 is my primary example of this. Is this a staff roll theme where I should be watching the credits roll, or should I be falling asleep to this? Because those two feel like the best options for this track. At least personally, stage theme definitely does not feel like one of those options. And I continue to feel the same way about most of this soundtrack for the entire first half of the game. Although, there is that one stage theme with a video that like kinda got a few views. It's pretty good, I guess. Anyway, this really was not a great start for Lotus Land Story. Luckily, however, after this point, the game really manages to kick itself up a notch. After all, this game was the birthplace of many iconic arrangements for the series. Some of the most notable ones include our protagonist Reimu's theme, Maiden's Capriccio, Marissa's theme, Vessel of Stars, and the Stage 4 theme, Alice Maestra. Reimu and Marissa's themes ultimately managed to bring the much needed unique and energetic elements respectively. Maiden's Capriccio fits Reimu charmingly well, and honestly provides an admittedly cute impression of her. Vessel of Stars simply has the energy of a star-wielding maniac, typical Marissa. And Alice Maestra is just a beautifully well-constructed theme, nothing more. But apart from those stages, there is one character that I felt vastly outperformed the PC-98 generation in terms of musical quality. I've already praised a handful of PC-98 character themes for some aspect or another, and I do believe they deserve the recognition. But in the end, I could still discern their limitations as a piece within the older generation. As good as many of these themes are, they undoubtedly depict the kind of quality one would expect from the PC-98 era titles. While this idea holds true for a lot of the characters I've talked about so far, there are two exceptions. Well, we won't be talking about the other one until much later, so let's tackle the first. The Lotus Land Story Stage 5 and 6 boss, Yuka. Personally, I feel that Zun represented Yuka's character so well that it almost transcends PC-98 status. It all starts out with her first theme, Sleeping Terror. It's half menacing due to the rather intimidating build-up at the beginning of this theme, but it's half goofy due to the fact that she's literally dressed up in a pink nightgown. Fun fact, apparently Zun wanted the background to be her bedroom, but he gave up on this idea due to hardware limitations. I would honestly kill to see how that would have been implemented, but nevertheless, I appreciate the goofiness Zun took towards this whole scenario. It's a really well-crafted theme, and is perfectly fitting for someone like Yuka. Like, seriously, I could even see Windows era Yuka jamming out to something like this. But hang on, we still have one more stage left. And here we arrive, ladies and gentlemen, to the undisputed peak of the PC-98 era. Yuka's second theme, Faint Dream, Inanimate Dream. I don't know how many kegs of beer Zun was on when he composed this theme, but he needs to keep it up because this shit is just next level. And the level of energy which emanates from this track really puts all the other tracks to shame. I never really poked around with the PC-98 generation of games until well after my first exposure to the project, so I find it difficult for such a primitive scope to compete with the musical complexities the Windows generation has to offer. But the few times it does, seriously portrays a charm which can't really be found in that Windows era. Is it my favorite theme from Lotus Land Story? I think so. Is it my favorite theme from the PC-98 generation as a whole? Well, maybe? I don't know. There are a lot of different themes with heaps of different musical styles, so it's hard to pick one. But I can't understate this theme's significance. It's moments like this which really bring me back to the PC-98 generation, even if it is for just one brief moment. I don't care. I just don't. I know I'm kind of obliged to talk about these extra stages since they are part of the game, but I honestly forgot this game even had an extra stage. Mugetsu and Gengetsu's themes are alright at least, so there's that. Not that I honestly care. I could barely bother listening to them, even when I had to for this script, and to be fair, I could barely bother talking about them anymore. I really could not be bothered. Yeah, that's really all that Lotus Land Story had to offer. As much as I would like to name everything I appreciated about this game's soundtrack, all it really boils down to was Yuka's themes, Reimu and Marisa's themes, the mid-game stage themes, and that's about it. Surprisingly, I didn't even care about the soundtrack as a whole comparably enough to something like Story of Eastern Wonderland. But despite that, I still put it higher. The main reason? Although this soundtrack as a whole was a bit of a mess, I think the highs outweighed the lows better than it did in Story of Eastern Wonderland, but just barely. Undeniably, we're still in the heart of the PC-98 era, but with the type of highs that Zun achieved in this title, I think it was pretty clear to say that the project was building quite a strong reputation for itself. Although I can't quite state that Lotus Land Story was iconic enough to bring the series to the level of recognition it deserves, it wasn't hard to tell that the little boost this series needed was lurking right around the corner. It's just Lotus Land Story again. No, I'm kidding, although that's not entirely wrong. Let's just say this will most likely be one of the shortest sections of this video. I say that since, although I like the soundtrack enough to wait until just now to talk about it, it feels almost identical to my experience with Lotus Land Story. Trust me, I've been mixing these two games up all the time now, including their soundtrack, so it's no surprise I inevitably feel the same way about them. That being said, when it comes to Mystic Square, I honestly do not have much to add on from Lotus Land Story. Are there any significant moments from this game which are even worth talking about? Well, maybe a couple. As I'd previously stated, I don't want to bore you by going through the whole story and repeating the same statements I did about Lotus Land Story. That means for this section, I'm only going to touch on the themes I actually have things to say about. Hold on to your hats, because it's about to get speedy. And we're starting right about now. Dimension of Reverie. Although Lotus Land Story really got off to a rough start when it came to its stage themes, Mystic Square handled the situation significantly better in that regard. This theme has energy, and it actually makes me excited to be a part of the story. And it's not only this stage, it was part of the first stage as well, but Dimension of Reverie is objectively better in my opinion. Side note, I take that back. Both of them are great. Also, since this theme is situated in border space, yeah, I know that's kind of a lame place to be situated in, but it just looks like the same outer space background from like a bunch of the PC-98 stages. I'm just gonna treat it as the world of fantasies, even though we're not actually in it, but I feel like this would be a better setting than whatever space we're floating around in. Does that sound good? Okay. The world of fantasies. I know that's not true, just roll with it for 1 second. That makes this one hell of a contrast between this stage and the previous rendition of this stage in Story of Eastern Wonderland. It's a minor connection, but it's a nice one. Romantic Children, Plastic Mine, and the Grimoire of Alice. I know I kinda broke the rules talking about these together, but I did it since they pertain to the same character, Alice Margatroyd. Yes, the same Alice from Perfect Cherry Blossom, who debuted in Lotus Land Story. Or Lawless, as some people call her. Weirdos. Now, this is probably due to her portrayal in the Windows generation of the project, since that is what most people are interested in, but I have a difficult time believing Windows Alice and Lawless, I hate saying that, it feels so weird, are actually the same character, because the way she is portrayed in Mystic Square is just creepy. In essence, all three themes just sound unsettling. The various locations we actually fight her, like Makai and the Wonderland, wonder where that came from, and the fact that she's given the title Witch of Death, like, does this really look like the creep that would be attached to all this? Although maybe keeping 527 imitation dolls of your deepest crush around your house is a bit creepy in itself, but that's just me. Maple-wise, this part of the track right here, it has a really weird progression. That's all I really wanted to point out. Doll of Misery. No, I'm not talking about you, Alice. Not gonna lie, kinda the same reasons as Maple-wise, although I feel that this track is much better. I like the beginning of this track. It's very wave-like, I guess, and like Alice's theme, has a bit of an unsettling feel. Zun actually mentioned that this was the most complex chord progressions he had ever done up to this point, and listening to this track in detail, yeah, I don't know how music production works, but it sounds like it'd be a complete pain in the ass to make. Legendary Illusion, Infinite Being. Okay, I'm not gonna waste your time. It's fantastic in just about all the best ways. It's perfectly fitting for Shinky, and it just sounds exactly like the last thing I would expect to hear before being absolutely torn to shreds. I previously said that this theme would be the perfect closer to Story of Eastern Wonderland, and that's because this theme is just so menacing and a perfect piece to close just about any story. I would talk more, but I think you get it. Alice in Wonderland. I'm adding this in post because silly me forgot to talk about the most popular theme from this game. This track is yet another Alice theme, similar to the three previous ones I'd mentioned, and I was debating lumping it there, but I decided it was too different to do so, but too good to pass up talking about completely. I mentioned the element of creepiness which those other themes evoked, but this one provided a much different perspective. The real tragedy of this track helped me sympathize with Alice, which is something I had kinda neglected from the previous tracks. I mean, think about it. This young magician, essentially trapped alone in Makai. The only things in her possession? Her grimoire and a few fairy dolls. These few things are really all that her time in Makai entails. The only road she could take, whether she likes it or not, is the grimoire itself. Left to follow the path of yokais and magic. It begs the question, is she truly committed to this life? And most importantly, for someone like Alice, is this truly a wonderland? Okay, enough of this speed round bullcrap. There are a few more tracks I actually want to talk about in detail, and this isn't gonna cut it. Those two tracks being the rather surprising themes of Yuki and Mai, mostly due to a pretty twisted but kind of funny gimmick for those who paid close attention during this stage. For those of you who are unaware, Stage 4 involves a double boss fight between both the Dark Witch Yuki and the Light Witch Mai, And trust me, it's not only their colors which are contrasting. In the early stages of this battle, it's just your average boss fight, but depending on who you decide to deal with first, the outcome of this stage can change quite drastically. You know, I think you've heard enough of my voice for now, so instead of telling you exactly what happens, why don't I show you? Man, I just love the PC-98 generation. Yeah, if you still didn't get that. Mai's an ungrateful piece of shit. My favorite thing about this? Well, it wouldn't be Touhou if it didn't have a matching soundtrack to go with it. And Zun composed each theme in exactly the perfect way to portray the scenario. Yuki's individual theme is fueled by nothing more than the uncontrollable rage and the unsufferable anguish for the loss of her partner. Mai's theme, on the other hand, no. Mai's individual theme is both amazing and genuinely hilarious. It's not primarily directed by rage, but being free from Yuki really seemed to unleash some new energy on her behalf. Simply put, if Yuki's theme sounds angry, Mai's theme sounds liberating. But the absolute best part about all of this? Mai fucking sucks. During each individual battle, Mai's spell cards are often considered to be less complex and much easier to deal with than Yuki's. This is despite all the loud mouthing she happened to express before the fight, as well as that increased sense of tenacity portrayed in her theme. This opinion is so strongly favored that even the Touhou wiki itself regards Mai's individual spell cards as much easier than Yuki's. This therefore implies that Treacherous Maiden, Judas Kiss is Mai's theme and only Mai's theme. This entire scenario is my personal highlight of Mystic Square, and another reason why I have such a fond appreciation for the PC-98 generation. Yuki and Mai's themes are the Mystic Square equivalent of Yuka's first and second themes from Lotus Land Story, themes which ultimately define each of these games for me. Another hidden gem in the pool of Zun's everlasting discography. Yeah, I told you it wasn't much. If you want the condensed version of my thoughts upon this game, just take everything I said during the outro of Lotus Land Story and apply it here. Apart from a few standouts, it was just pretty good as a whole. Not much more than that. The only thing I could really mention about this game is that it was the final game from the PC-98 generation of the project, which is understandable. It's really hard for me to judge, but I feel like a 6th PC-98 game wouldn't bring this series justice. There was no way that the evolution of this series could simply be contained to the PC-98, so Mystic Square was the departure from this generation. Whether it was due to Zun expanding his musical aptitude, the musical and computational limitations of the PC-98, or a combination of both or some other factors, it was about time to move on. Regardless, I think Mystic Square was a fitting send-off. Wait a minute, we're missing a game, aren't we? Do I truthfully believe that Phantasmagoria of Dimensional Dream has the best soundtrack of all the PC-98 games? Absolutely. Does it still feel wrong on just about every level to say this? Abso-frickin-lutely. With the understandable exception of highly responsive to prayers, the 4 remaining PC-98 games all follow the shmup style the series is known for. But while Story of Eastern Wonderland, Lotus Land Story, and Mystic Square were all caught up in their story-based vertical scroller, Phantasmagoria of Dimensional Dream was like... Yeah, anyway, it was like a competitive game as opposed to a vertical scroller. But what does this mean for its soundtrack? Well, heaps more character themes to deal with as opposed to other titles, and here's the big one. No stage themes? How the hell did I think this is the best PC-98 soundtrack again? If you can't already tell, I take the story into pretty strong consideration when it comes to my enjoyment of a certain title. And with the lack of stage themes and sparse dialogue throughout this title, it ended up putting this one in a bit of a predicament for me. With the story essentially out of the question for a majority of this title, this leaves me with the next best option: character themes. And to put it simply, Zun had 9 different personalities to deal with, but he played each one pretty damn well. Kinda. I'll get to it later. I guess it shows that you don't really need to emphasize the story for me to enjoy it. This is why I have such a hard time praising this game, when it goes against what I typically expect from what I would consider a good title and a great soundtrack. But regardless of the fact, something tells me that Phantasmagoria of Dimensional Dream deserved to be on top, and that I have a lot of explaining to do. As it turned out, I think there was a lot I could learn from Phantasmagoria of Dimensional Dream. Going back to my analysis of Highly Responsive to Prayers, I touched on the importance of individual identity within the series. Long story short, an absence of identity leads to an absence of subject. I simply can't appreciate something when I can't identify what it represents. And when it comes to Phantasmagoria of Dimensional Dream, I seriously thought it was going down that road. If you actually look at the soundtrack, out of the 20 tracks, 11 of them are non-character themes. 2 of them are win-loss jingles, and 5 of them are title, ending, or staff roll themes, leaving us with only 4 unique environmental themes in the thick of this game's plot. It doesn't seem like much to me. I mean, there is the manual, which does provide substantial information about the characters, but come on, it's 2024, who actually reads this? And besides, deep connections prosper from in-game experiences. There's only so much you could become attached to through reading a slip of paper. So what's left? Well, as I said, the one element which carried this game all the way to the top: character themes. Yeah, I know, it seems a little outlandish, but why don't I give you an example? How about Ellen, let's say. On the surface, she seems like an ordinary girl with a rather mischievous melody, but if you make an effort to understand her circumstances, I think it starts to become a little more clear. Ellen, for some reason, continuously loses her memories in chunks, basically condemning her to eternal life as a child. Do I know why she loses her memories? Kinda, yes, actually. Although it doesn't explicitly state in the manual. I lied, it kinda does. Technically. It turns out that Ellen is a parody of a different character, also named Ellen, from this Japanese manga. Along with Touhou Ellen having a very similar appearance, a cat with the same name, and a request to open up a magic shop similar to the one owned by Manga Ellen during Touhou Ellen's ending, Manga Ellen, despite her childish appearance, supposedly comes from a family of magical users, and is a full-fledged witch herself. So there you go. Touhou Ellen probably loses her memories to act as a canonically permanent homage to the historical manga character she's based off of. Nobody asked me to explain this. Why the hell am I talking about this? Anyway, using her poor excuse for Alzheimer's, Zun demonstrates that he is more than capable of producing what I would describe to be the absolute perfect theme for Ellen. Why is this? Well, the fact that the nonchalant and playful melody just loops repeatedly to a point where it almost becomes prophetically disturbing, in my opinion. How the phrase tabula rasa refers to the theory that humans are born without pre-existing mental context. The fact that this phrase is used to represent a girl who constantly loses her memories during each passing day, and the fact that Zin threw the phrase the empty girl just to rub it in. It's difficult for me to find this thematic connection in any other PC-98 game, but this feels like a way riskier way of plot writing. Without dialogue or stage info, my ultimate impression on these characters relies almost entirely on whether I like their theme or not. Luckily, I felt that Zun played out each character rather well. Or maybe he didn't even need to. With such minimal context, we're almost forced to write the situations ourselves. Maybe the reason I like this title so much is because with such little compositional restrictions, Ellen's theme fits Ellen as much as I myself wanted Ellen's theme to fit Ellen. Of course, this occurs in other titles to an extent. What about Highly Responsive to Prayers, for example? This sounds a lot like that scenario. The difference is that in Phantasmagoria of Dimensional Dream, we at least have some context, and the character themes expand upon that information. In Highly Responsive to Prayers, as I said, there's almost no identity. For a majority of the time, we might as well be fighting against some nameless creature. But I'm getting sidetracked again. In the 3 other PC-98 games, stage themes and character dialogue help to restrict the interpretive lens accordingly. In Phantasmagoria of Dimensional Dream, there's not much restricting that can be done. Do I think that this has an influence on my enjoyment? Of course I do, this whole video is subjective after all. But regardless, I really enjoy Ellen's theme and what it represents. There are of course other examples of this throughout this title, but I think Ellen was simply the easiest to explain. Alright, maybe that was a little bit overkill with Ellen, but I picked this game as the best PC-98 soundtrack for a reason. And since I don't want this video to be 8 hours long, trust me, based on the way the last paragraph went, it could have been. I just briefly want to touch upon the other character tracks, at the very least. Not all character tracks in this game have a rabbit hole as deep as Ellen's. Some of them are nothing more than just simple bangers. And from what I've noticed, mostly from the characters we are already familiar with, Reimu, Mima, Marissa. We know who they are, so no need for nonsense. This leaves us with 4 pre-final stage characters left. I'll just briefly touch on them, I guess. First up, Kotahime. Despite being a princess of something, she is a pretty weird specimen. No, I mean literally, other characters also call her weird. You know who that also includes? Zun himself. And not only is he talking about Kotahime, he also feels the same way about her theme. It's a very simplistic theme, but I think it has some sarcastic sense of royalty, which I find kind of funny. She's a weirdo princess after all. Of course it fits. Next up, Kana. She is a poltergeist produced by a mentally unstable girl. What? Whatever that means for her, I kinda had a hunch based on her theme. This theme always sounded a bit dejected to me, since the chorus plays out in such a low tone, and it has an incredibly slow and almost lifeless tempo. In a good way. It almost makes me feel bad for Kana, as even Zun said he wanted this theme to sound cuter. But then again, he also said that this wasn't even initially her song, so maybe it's right to sound depressed. Next up we have Rikako, however you say it, I don't know. Rikako is a bit of a special character in this project. This is because she is one of the only few characters in the entire project who actually wears glasses, believes in science rather than magic. To represent her, she has what feels to be a really serious and down-to-earth theme in my opinion. Zun thinks it's pretty cool, and so do I, since we don't typically get themes which sound intimidating but are played out at such a slow pace. Also, her theme doesn't loop until 4 minutes 57 seconds, which is the longest looping theme in the project. Unfortunately, if you're actually fighting her in-game, chances are it won't last nearly that long, but it's very repetitive, you're not missing out on much. And finally, we have Chiuri. If you got up to this point in-game, we actually have a bit of context surrounding her thanks to the in-game cutscenes, where despite her stuck-up personality, she cements herself as a bit of a goofball. And I think that's how I would describe her theme as well. Pure diligence outlined in a layer of pure goofiness. It has a sense of charm to it, which ultimately shrouds her in a sense of mystery. You know, mysteries like why she decided to dress up in a sailor uniform, and how she graduated from university and is registered as an assistant professor at the age of 15. I know I kinda answered the Ellen question, but I promise you, these questions I will never find the answer to. Oh, for fuck's sake. You know, I've done enough explaining. If you're so hard-pressed for an answer, you figure it out. I know I've stated multiple times that this game really seemed to lack on environmental themes, but I didn't say they were completely absent from this title. There are an aforementioned small handful of tracks which do attempt to push the story forward, so I guess I could get those out of the way. One of which is the Round 7 battle theme. If you couldn't already point out, it's the theme that plays out during the 7th and final matchup before being granted access into the ruins. I have conflicting views surrounding this theme. On one hand, it sounds great, and Zun stacking all the odds against you during this round, it just makes for an ever more intense fight. But on the other hand, it doesn't matter who the stage 7 boss is. This is the theme that plays regardless. If you get someone like Ellen, for example, it's still good, but it just seems a little off. I need to stop talking about Ellen, she's taking up like half of this title analysis. The remaining tracks we have yet to look at for this title are the pre-battle themes for the final stages. I understand how, for a large chunk of this title, I repeatedly emphasize the idea surrounding the lack of stage themes and overall context. Well, part of that is because the 2 instances where he actually does provide stage context are completely unparalleled in their ability to elevate the story. This is what I was missing from the other fights. Not even this intense, just something to bring me into who I'm actually fighting. Although both of these themes feel very over the top in essence, I can't deny that this game truly wouldn't be the same without them. Now, you all know that there is one last theme which I've yet to talk about, and it may be one of the most recognizable tracks not only from Phantasmagoria of Dimensional Dream, but also the PC-98 generation. Ladies and gentlemen, That theme is, of course, the character select theme. Truly, you can't define Phantasmagoria of Dimensional Dream without this theme. The tides of the plot ultimately depend on your decision, and this track makes that clear. Never will this track be outclassed by anything to come in the project. This is true musical perfection. Huh? Don't worry, I wasn't gonna forget you. Remember my analysis of Luda's land story, when I discussed that just about all the PC-98 games felt grounded within their generation? I followed this up by stating that there were exactly 2 exceptions to this rule. The first one being Yuka, and I discussed my feelings about her then and there. Well, may I introduce exception number 2, Yumemi Okazaki. I know I previously said that Yuka's second theme was my personal favorite from the PC-98 era, but by God, this was not an easy decision. It's amusing to think that the title with some of the most whimsically youthful, inscrutably quaint, and downright asinine sets of characters would also be home to one of the most contentiously aggressive hardcore metal arrangements in the series. But when this song is blasting, I could give a shit about the logistics. Although I could try and explain to you why I think this theme is so great. I think it speaks for itself. I mean, just listen to this for a second. I don't really think I need to elaborate further. The only semi-gripe I have with this theme is the actual context surrounding it. Do I think that Phantasmagoria of Dimensional Dream is the perfect title to house this arrangement? No, absolutely not. But keep in mind, this was only the 3rd Touhou game Zun had ever released, so I don't exactly blame him. I'm just saying, maybe a title known for being a little bit more aggressive would suit this theme better. Something along the lines of Wily Beast and Weakest Creature, since putting a theme like this in a game like Phantasmagoria of Dimensional Dream feels rather out of place. Maybe then would I consider this my favorite theme from the PC-98 era. Just maybe. Now that I've spilled out most of my thoughts surrounding this game, what else is there to say? First of all, do I still think this is the best PC-98 soundtrack? Yes, I think I've made that very clear. Does it still feel wrong to say that? I think so. I don't think I will ever get over it, but I still have a hard time believing it. I never thought that this cacophony of a game would be home to my favorite of Zun's PC-98 soundtracks, but that's how it ended up. I keep going back to the statement I said about interpretive freedom when I think of this title. It was the major difference between this game, along with Highly Responsive to Prayers, with the rest of the PC-98 generation. And funnily enough, I ended up placing them on polar opposites within this ranking. At its worst, this sort of thing omits the major details needed to develop the story, without even granting the relevant information to fill in the gaps. At its best, however, it outlines a beautifully complex and touching experience, but it leaves the final regards to the player, to paint the rest of the picture how they see fit. If that's the case, maybe that's why I have such an undeniable soft spot for this soundtrack. Sure, it's not as straightforward as many of the other titles, but that's what makes my favorite titles so enjoyable. Within the Touhou Project, at least most of the time, it's the energetic, dynamic, and awe-inspiring tracks which I enjoy while I'm here. But it's the touching and emotionally heart-wrenching tracks which bring me back to why I really love this project. I can like something for how it sounds, but I can only love something for what it represents. Phantasmagoria of Dimensional Dream was the only one out of the 5 PC-98 games we have looked at which provided me with that opportunity. So, I'll say it once more. Is Phantasmagoria of Dimensional Dream the best PC-98 soundtrack? Well, it's up to you to paint that picture. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. My definitive ranking of the PC-98 soundtrack. Despite my innumerable interest in the Windows generation of this project, I knew that in order to fully answer this question I stated at the beginning of this video, I would eventually have to touch upon these titles. And man, what a ride it was. Here's what I personally will have to say. Do I think that we should start to wipe out the line planted between the soundtracks of the PC-98 and Windows generations? Do I think that these games deserve to represent the entirety of this project? Do I think Highly Responsive to Prayers, Story of Eastern Wonderland, Phantasmagoria of Dim Dream, Lotus Land Story, or Mystic Square could ever possibly compete with what the Windows generation of this project has to offer? The answer to all of those questions is no. I do not think that we should be bridging the gap between the two generations, since they are fundamentally different in countless ways. In my opinion, these titles, at least on their own accord, do not represent the true potential this project pertains, nor the direction it continues to proceed in the modern era. And most importantly, as acceptable as many of these games are, I cannot possibly bring myself to praise any of these soundtracks above the level of ingenuity, complexity, and charm found in the Windows generation. But despite that, the PC-98 generation deserves its recognition for its role in birthing one of the most legendary series to ever hit the community. With all that being said, I'll leave this video and the PC-98 generation with this. I will never get over my love for the Windows generation to show me this project's true colors, but in order to make that happen, it was truly the PC-98 generation which made that possible. So, until then, let us reunite in the Windows generation. Thank you for watching.